bond of marriage, so the two people's souls are bound together in marriage. And this is a very real thing. It's a spiritual bond. Now, sometimes when people hear that word spiritual and say in today's culture, maybe what do they kind of think? Kind of maybe like, well, not really real. Like, you can't see it, so it's not really real. It's kind of what you want it to be. It's spiritual, right? But we Catholics don't view it that way. When we say something is spiritual, and in this case, the spiritual bond of marriage, that bond is as real as the sun in the sky. It is a real thing. We can't see it, but it's a real thing. So because of that, marriage demands unity and indissolubility. If two people are bound in marriage, they can't decide, well, today I want to be married, but tomorrow I don't want to be married. Oh, and then next week I want to be married again, and then 3 weeks from now I don't want to be married, right? Marriage demands this permanence, this indissolubility. It also, for obvious reasons, demands fidelity. You can't say, well, I want to be faithful to you now and not be faithful to you next week and then be faithful to you again. It doesn't work that way. Okay? Marriage must be open to children for the reason that I said already in the structure. We'll come back to 5 and 6 if we have time. But just a word on sexual relations then. So God has made sexual relations in marriage to be the physical expression of the spiritual bond. So again, going back to what I said, right? When two people get married, their souls are bound together spiritually, and God has made it so that sexual relations are the physical expression of that spiritual bond. That's kind of an amazing thing, that God allows what can't be seen to be expressed in a way that can be seen and can be experienced. So do you see why sexual relations outside of marriage then don't make any sense, right? It's kind of like lying with one's body. It's like saying, I'm expressing something that actually doesn't exist. So that's why God says it's a sin, because it's really an empty act, right? It's only when there's a truly marriage bond to be expressed that God's design for that makes sense. Sexual relations, as the Catechism says, also express and deepen the union and, of course, bring procreation. Okay. Go ahead.
Why isn't this explained to people, a couple that are married?
I explain it. So she asked, why isn't this explained to the couple when they get married? Go ahead. Yes. Yeah. Right. Right.
And that was, they didn't have anything like that explained other than the obvious.
Sure.
I guess that kind of went over everybody's head.
Mm.
I mean, we were 21, and we should know better. We both were Catholics from the beginning.
Yeah.
None of that was in depth.
Sure.
I didn't hear any of that.
Right. Well, we definitely need to do a better job of it. And not that this teaching wasn't there before, but the one person who really brought this understanding to the fore was Pope John Paul II. So his teaching about the body, the theology of the body, what sexual relations mean, has really brought this before our eyes in the church. Doesn't mean it wasn't there before, but you're right. This teaching is unbelievably important for every Catholic, every person to understand. Yeah, you're right. So we need to do even a better job of doing it, you're right. I try to explain it when I have couples, but yeah. Yeah. Right. Yes.
Also justifies or encourages people to have Catholic education.
Yeah.
Because it is explained, at least back in my days, with the it was.
Yeah.
And so I knew that before I went into it.
Yeah.
We do not become priests.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and even today, it is taught in our high schools, but it's one thing to learn something when you're 15, and it's another thing to relearn it when you're 21 or 22 and about to enter into marriage, right? So we need to hear this at various stages in our life so that we understand it and can apply it, to our lives. Yeah, good. Okay, good? Yes? Oh, yeah. Sorry, we had a little time discrepancy, so it said in the bulletin 7 p.m., and everywhere else it said 6:30 p.m., so I compromised and started at 6:45. Okay? So those of you who have come in late, just real quick, you'll see on the sheet that I just gave you, I was explaining the structure of marriage, how God has created marriage, that it comes from Him, that it's a covenant, which means the people are exchanged, people themselves are exchanged for the partnership of the whole of life, and for the purpose of the good of the spouses and procreation and education of children. How's that? Okay, good. All right, so the aspect that I want to talk about tonight, obviously there's a lot of aspects that can be talked about with marriage. You can talk about the interpersonal relationship of marriage, so forth and so on. We're going to save that for another day sometime, or some other priest to do that. The aspect that I want to talk about today is the validity of marriage. So when two people are entering marriage, what makes it so that marriage actually happens, that the marriage actually takes place when two people marry? So we look at three things. This is in the middle of page 2. Three things together must be looked at when we consider when two people enter into marriage that makes it truly a marriage: consent, impediments, and form. And I want to start with form because it's actually the easiest one to understand. So the form is basically the ceremony. When two people get married, there has to be a certain form in order for it to take place. And not only does the church say this, but even, for example, the state of Indiana would say it, right? So two people can't just go out in the woods and say vows to one another and say to the state of Indiana, we're married. The state of Indiana said, well, no, you got to get a license, you got to be married, you say your vows in front of a minister, there's a certain form to it in which it has to take place. And the church says the same thing. So, for marriages involving two non-Catholics, and that can be any kind of non-Catholics, two Methodists, two Lutherans, two non-baptized people, a non-baptized person and a Lutheran, marriages involving two non-Catholics, all that is needed for form is the public exchange of consent, so that's the vows, consent is the vows, the public exchange of consent with two witnesses, okay? So this is a common misunderstanding, even among Catholics a lot of times. So let's say that you have two Methodists get married, and they get divorced, and then a Catholic wants to marry one of those Methodists. And the Catholic might say, well, they weren't married in the Catholic Church, so it doesn't count. Well, it does count, because they're not Catholic. And if two non-Catholics say their vows in front of two witnesses, we say as far as the form goes, it's a valid marriage. Now, number two, for marriages involving Catholics, it's the same thing, public exchange of consent before two witnesses, but also there has to be what's called in canon law an assistens. An assistens is an authorized bishop, priest, or deacon to receive their vows. So in other words, Catholics have the additional obligation under form to be married in front of a priest or a deacon or a bishop. Usually it's a priest, right? But a deacon or a priest, deacon or bishop can witness to. So this gets into if, let's say that you have a Catholic that doesn't marry before assistens. They go to the Methodist church and they say their vows before two witnesses and the Methodist minister. As far as form goes, valid or invalid? It's not valid, correct. A Catholic must be married before an assistens, an authorized bishop, priest, or deacon. And if they're not, it's invalid. And actually, it's when that occurs and then a divorce happens, This is a very easy process to prove. It still goes through the tribunal, but it's just a matter of some paperwork. It can literally take only as long as a week to kind of prove this. Is it 2 young Catholics or 2 young Methodists? It doesn't matter where the Catholic gets married. If they don't get married before a priest, bishop, or deacon, it's invalid. It doesn't matter about the minister. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I'll get to that. Hang on to that. I'll get to that. Okay. Now, by the way, when I say invalid, what does that mean? Invalid means that the spiritual bond that I described before actually never happened. It might have looked like it happened because the 2 people said their vows to one another, but it actually never happened. It's invalid. When I say valid, I mean that we presume that it did happen and that it does exist. Okay, so just to get our terms there. Now, by the way, number 3, just a little caveat, this canonical form that Catholics are obliged to can be dispensed. So sometimes you have, like, say, a Catholic marrying a Lutheran, and the Lutheran's dad is a Lutheran minister, and so they go through normal Catholic marriage. They apply to the bishop, and actually, in this case, they apply to me because I'm the one that does all these. They apply to me and say, we want to be dispensed from having to say our vows in front of an assistens, and that is regularly dispensed. So it is possible for a Catholic to be married outside the Catholic Church, but only with that particular dispensation. Okay? So that's form. Yeah. So let's say a Catholic wants to marry a Lutheran in the Lutheran Church. That can happen if they get a dispensation from the Catholic form. But normally, if the Catholic just runs off to the Lutheran Church to get married, that would be invalid. Okay? Good. Good? Yes? Yes. Anyone who is baptized in the Catholic Church or received in the Catholic Church after being baptized in some other. Yeah. Yep. Invalid. Yep. Because the Catholic, even if they're a non-practicing Catholic, they're still bound by canonical form. Yep. Yes. Yes. Yeah. I've never said no to one. Okay? Mm-hmm. Yes. If they marry outside the church. If they marry in the church, it's presumed valid. Yeah, because a Catholic can marry a non-Catholic, but it has to be in the church, unless it's dispensed. Okay? That's why you have canon lawyers like me to keep it all straight. Okay, so Catholic form is one thing that we look at. By the way, just so you know this, let's say a Catholic marries a non-baptized person in the Catholic Church, valid, right? But not a sacrament. Follow me? It's a valid natural marriage. Because what do you have to do to have the sacrament of marriage? You have to have 2 baptized people marrying, right? So let's say you have a Catholic and a non-baptized person get married in the Catholic Church, valid natural marriage. Then the non-baptized person goes through the OCIO program, and at the Easter Vigil gets baptized. Guess what happens to their marriage? Automatic sacrament. The moment the water and the words hit the non-baptized person, it automatically becomes a sacrament. Yeah, that's very cool. So a Catholic marries a non-baptized person in the Catholic Church. Valid natural marriage, but not a sacrament. because you have to have two baptized people to have a sacrament. The non-baptized person goes through instructions in the Catholic Church and gets baptized. The moment they get baptized, the marriage becomes a sacrament. We don't have to do anything to it. God just makes it a sacrament. Yeah. Okay. So the second thing we look at with regard to the validity of marriage is called impediments. And impediments are, as you see the definition there, characteristics of a person or situations which keep one from truly entering into marriage. There are 12 impediments. We're not going to go through all of them, but I've given you some examples here so you get the idea of it. So, one impediment is insufficient age. According to the Church, a man has to be 16 years old and a woman has to be at least 14 years old in order validly to enter into marriage. So if a 13-year-old woman tries to enter into marriage, even let's say it's a Catholic before a Catholic priest, it's two Catholics, it would be invalid because she has the impediment of age. She's not old enough, according to church law, to enter into marriage. So the marriage would be invalid. Yes? Not what the church says. The states might have different ages that people can enter into marriage, but the Catholic Church says that you cannot validly enter into marriage unless you're these ages. So it kind of doesn't matter what the state says. Maybe for the state, but not for the church. Or Tennessee. Yeah. I'm only half joking because it's lower there than it is Indiana. Some of the southern states are lower. I'm not really joking. I'm just saying they are lower. But for the church, it has to be 16 and 14. Doesn't matter what the state says. The state might say 13. It doesn't matter. It has to be 14. Okay? Number 2, legamen. So legamen is a fancy word that means prior existing valid bond. Basically, it means you can't be married to two people at once. Even if the state says that you're divorced, the church says that spiritual bond still presumes to exist. Okay? Doesn't matter what the state of Indiana says. So that means that the person has an impediment to enter a new marriage because there's already a marriage. There's already an existing bond, prior existing valid bond. Good on that? It would be invalid, yes. I don't want to complicate this too much. It would be invalid unless later it's discovered that it was invalid, but that's only for non-Catholics because Catholics are still bound by canonical form. So even if they enter a second so-called marriage, Catholics, it still would be not valid because they wouldn't be able to do that in the church. They'd have to go somewhere else to do that. Well, like I said, I don't want to get too complicated there, but yeah. Number 3, the impediment of sacred orders. So I have an impediment to marry because I'm in sacred orders, right? So let's say I went up to Wisconsin, lied to the priest, didn't tell him I was a priest, went through the whole Catholic ceremony. I would be invalidly married because I haven't to marry. Same number 4, public perpetual vow of chastity in a religious institute. So this would be like a religious sister or a religious brother. So same deal, right? They have an impediment to marry. Even if they lied and went somewhere else, they wouldn't be truly married. Number 5, abduction. You're going to love this one. So if a man abducts a woman in order to marry her, the marriage is invalid. But it only goes that way. If a woman abducts a man in order to marry him, you know why that is? Why it only goes one way? Because some of these church laws are written because of historical conditions. So there must have been a time in the church where men were abducting women in order to marry them. But women usually don't abduct men in order to marry them. So it didn't need to have the law the other way. It needed to have the law just the one way. Okay. Number 6, conjugicide, killing of a spouse in order to marry them. So, John and Susie are married. Paul really likes Susie and wants to marry her, so he has a hit put out on John so he can marry Susie. Okay? Even though Susie's now free to marry because John is dead, Paul has an impediment because he's killed John in order to marry. Now, actually, there's kind of a modern-day example of this. Do you know what it is? There was a famous example maybe about 20 years ago. Terry Schiavo. Do you remember the Terry Schiavo case? Where Terry Schiavo was, I don't want to use, the word comatose, because she wasn't really comatose, but she couldn't fully communicate, but she was stable. She wasn't dying. They were feeding her, giving her liquids. She just had to be under constant care. I don't remember if she had an accident or if it was a disease of some sort that put her in that condition. But her husband wanted to marry someone else. And so through the state of Florida, he had all her care removed so that she basically just starved to death, right? He was Catholic too, by the way. So this canon would kick in here because he had her killed in order for him to marry someone else. So he would be invalidly married. Number 7, consanguinity. So that is blood relations. So marriage is always invalid in the direct line. So a grandfather can't marry his granddaughter. That's the direct line. The collateral line is the sideways lines. So through the 4th degree, you can't be married. So 4th degree, would be first cousins. First cousins can't be married, 4th degree. First cousins once removed could be married, so that would be 5th degree, yeah. But anyway, just to point out, obviously there's certain blood relationships that are invalid. Now, Canon 1085, so that's the one about legamen, prior existing valid bond, and some of Canon 1091 is natural law. That means it comes from God and can't be dispensed. The other ones can be dispensed. One that I didn't tell you here, by the way, is a Catholic cannot marry a non-baptized person. That's an impediment. But that can be dispensed and regularly is dispensed. I do those dispensations for our diocese. That happens all the time. So just to point out how that dispensation might work, that even with some of these impediments. Okay, so we go down impediments. Yeah, so a Catholic cannot marry a non-baptized person. That's an impediment. It's called disparity of cult. But that impediment can be dispensed and regularly is. So when we do the marriage paperwork for engaged couple, the priest would mark disparity of cult, the reason, and then I dispense it. Yeah. So that's a regular dispensation. There are some places in the world where that dispensation isn't given, especially in Muslim countries, if a Catholic wants to marry a Muslim, because in some Muslim countries, there's no way that the Catholic would be able to remain being Catholics, so they won't give the dispensation because of that. But that's only in a very few places in the world that's the case. Okay, so we good? On form, go down impediments, yes? No, it's still just a natural marriage, right? But it would be valid, a valid natural marriage if the dispensation is given. Yeah, yes? The priest who's marrying you does that. So when they come in for the marriage prep, there's paperwork, and he knows that one's non-baptized and one's baptized, and there's special things that he marks on the paperwork, and then he sends it in to me, and I grant it from his paperwork. So the couple themselves don't have to know that. Yeah. Now here's a little trick. I use the word trick, but on the other end of it, when a Catholic has married a non-baptized, and then let's say they get divorced, and that comes to the tribunal, I always make sure that that dispensation was actually given, because sometimes it's missed. And if it's missed, then it's an invalid marriage. And the person doesn't have to go through the whole process of annulment because it's clear it's invalid. Yes. Yes, or at least I did. I always did. Yeah. And there were at least 2 occasions that I can think of that by just doing a little detective work, I was able to find out that actually the marriage was invalid because they didn't get the dispensation. Now, we started to get into the realm of mystery there about what God does and doesn't do. I'm speaking as a canon lawyer, okay? And there was no dispensation, so there was no valid marriage. Yeah. What grace God provides is up to God. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So let me think about how we did that. I think we ran it as an annulment case, but it was very quick because it was just really a matter of paperwork. Yeah. So there would have been a decree of nullity, and then, like with all the decrees of nullity, there's a note put on the person's baptismal record and in the marriage record that this was declared null, so forth. Yeah. Sure. Okay? All right, now we come into the hard one. Those were the easy ones. Consent and form. Impediments and form, those are the easy ones. Consent. So on page 2, you'll see, well, on page 3 too, I guess. I've repeated it. So the definition of consent is an act of the will whose object is marriage. So break that down, easy enough. What is an act of the will? It's a choice. So I choose to enter marriage with this person. That's what consent is. I choose to enter marriage with this person. But marriage, as defined by God and the church, so what we said before, the partnership of the whole of life between a man and a woman for the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of children. So I choose to enter that marriage with this person, okay? Now let's talk about how we were made. And this is Catholic anthropology. We believe this. Not all the world believes this. You get into some strange psychologies, they don't believe this. But we as Catholics believe this is how we are made, right? That God has made us with senses. We have 5 of them. And with those 5 senses, we take in information about what we experience, okay? That information that we take in from the senses goes to our intellects, so our minds, our ability to think. The intellect processes that information, and then our will is the power that we use to choose from what our intellect has processed, right? So the 3 parts of us, senses, to the intellect, and then the will chooses. So let's use an easy example, because we do this 1,000 times a day. I walk past the ice cream shop. My eyes see, oh, ice cream shop. Goes to my intellect. My intellect says, I like ice cream. Do I have time to go in and have some ice cream? Or maybe I put on a little weight and I shouldn't have ice cream. And then my will chooses, I'm going to have ice cream, okay? 1,000 times a day we do that, right? With all kinds of things. We don't even think about it, right? This is the process that we use to live, okay? So when someone gets married, that process happens too, right? You experience someone, you fall in love, you like to be with the person, you think about wanting to spend the rest of your life with them, you think about what it would be like for you to spend the rest of your life with them, you think about what it would be like to have children with them and to raise children and to grow old together, and then you make a decision to choose. Yeah, I want to choose marriage with that person, okay? Now that process has to work well, because choosing to enter marriage isn't just like choosing to get ice cream. Choosing to get ice cream is a simple choice. That process doesn't have to work all that well in order for you to choose ice cream. But in order for you to choose marriage which is a life-determining decision, that process has to work sufficient to the level of what you're choosing, which is a life-choosing decision. Follow me so far? Okay. So when the tribunal looks at consent, one of the things that it may look at is this question. When the person entered into marriage, did that process work sufficiently for the choice that they were making? And in some cases, if there was a grave lack of that ability at that moment, then the person didn't validly marry. So let's go back to, this is really actually for those lawyers in the group, this is actually really contract law, right? You can't enter into a contract that you're not able to stand what you're entering into. Okay? So it's the same for marriage. If I don't really understand or can't understand, not really I should say it that way, it's not that I don't understand, but that I don't have the capacity to understand what I'm entering into, then the marriage is invalid. Because I'm not freely choosing what I'm entering. Follow me on that? Okay. So I've given you three different, what we call grounds in the tribunal of that. So that's on page 3, under A, under consent. See, incapacity of will. Do you see that? So number 1, lack the sufficient use of reason. So this is a person who is very mentally incapacitated. I never ran a case on that. So it would have to be someone whose mental faculties are really don't function. Number 2 is what I've just described, what's called grave lack of discretion of judgment. And that process that I explained didn't work well enough in order for a person to enter into marriage. They gravely lacked the discretion of judgment. Now, what could cause a grave lack of discretion of judgment? Psychological disorders can cause that. By the way, that doesn't mean that everyone who has a psychological disorder has grave lack of judgment, because they don't. The connection has to be made between the psychological disorder causing them to have grave lack of discretion, but they don't always. Like some people can have, they struggle with psychological disorders, but they can still enter into marriage validly. But sometimes those psychological disorders make it so they can't. They have disrupted that process so enough that they aren't able to do that. Things like alcoholism, but with the same caveat. It doesn't mean that everyone who is an alcoholic can't enter into marriage, but some people who are alcoholics can enter into marriage because that has been disrupted. It also can be situational. So 16-year-old gets pregnant, father throws her out of the house because she's an embarrassment to the family. She has no way to really support herself, so she enters into marriage with the father of the child, basically because she has to. Okay? The situation has caused her not to be able to consider sufficiently what she's doing freely to enter into marriage. Okay, I saw a hand up. You good? Yes.
Now, we have a case of mental illness
Yes.
that is proves it's a family,
Uh-huh.
and the annulment is granted. Then we have another case that comes along, and it's not been diagnosed because of the mental illness of the person. Doesn't think they're mentally ill.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that's been pointed out about the mental illness, such as narcissism, personality disorder,
Mm-hmm.
that type of thing.
Yes.
How is the judgment made in that case?
Yes. So the judgment made in that case, did everybody hear her? Okay, so she said, let's say that there's a diagnosis in a person of, I think you said personality disorder and narcissism, right? How is a judgment made in that case? Well, the judge looks at the totality of the circumstances and the situation So that there's a diagnosis, and we use psychological experts a lot of times in annulment cases, so that there's a diagnosis by an expert. Okay. Right. Yeah. Well, sometimes what we do is, if we have enough witness testimony about the actions of the person and how they how they relate, and then we have a psychological expert look at all the testimony, and might be able to make some indications about what could be there as far as a mental situation, even though the person themselves won't allow themselves to be examined. Okay? So, just to finish your question then, so there is a diagnosis of a mental anomaly in one way or the other. Yeah, but I'm saying in the tribunal we could have a psychologist look at the evidence and could come to that conclusion that, oh, this person manifests all the marks of narcissistic personality disorder. And then, in addition to that, you can't just have a diagnosis. You have to show that that psychological anomaly caused the person not to be able to understand what they were doing when they entered into marriage. It's not just because a person has a psychological disorder. It has to be shown that that interrupted this process of them being able freely and with understanding to choose marriage. Yeah. That's all examined in the tribunal, all those details. Yeah. Yes? I haven't come to that one yet. Yes. No, that means psychological. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a psychological issue. That's what this word means there. That means psychological. The word psychic in this context means psychological. Which word? Well, in this case, that word that says that, psychic nature, that means psychological. Yes. In the canonical sphere, that means psychological. Some judge in Rome. Yeah. Yeah, well, it fits in this context, because it means psychological. Yeah. Okay. This word here, psychic, doesn't mean like going to a palm reader or something. Yeah, right. Yeah. Right. Sure. Let's hang on to that. That's at the end. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I would have to see that in context. I really would have no idea what the judge means by that without seeing the actual decree, yeah. 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 Yeah, okay, well, I didn't write that one, so. I haven't written a judgment since 2018, so, okay. All right, so number 3, incapacity to assume the essential elements of marriage due to a defect of a psychic nature. So this means where number 2 is looking at sort of how the person is able to discern to choose marriage, number 3 means how they are actually able to fulfill the obligations of marriage. So it could be that the person knows what they're doing when they're entering marriage, but they have a psychological, there you go. They have a psychological defect that keeps them from being able to fulfill what they've promised. So again, what are the things that a person promises? To be faithful, to be permanent, to be open to children. So let's just take the one, severe alcoholism. Again, it doesn't mean that every alcoholic can't marry, but let's say that there's a case where there's a severe alcoholic, and because of his severe alcoholism, he's constantly at the bar. Because he's constantly drunk, he's constantly being unfaithful because he picks somebody up at the bar all the time, right? So he can't fulfill what he promised to fulfill because of the alcoholism. Or you could take, well, the sexual disorders. I mean, you could think of how that might work out, where someone has a sexual disorder so severe that for the same reason, like they can't be faithful. Okay. So then the marriage would be invalid because just, again, like with a contract, let's go back to our contract here, right? About the car and the keys and the title. If she didn't have the money, then the contract can't be fulfilled, right? So if a person doesn't have the ability to fulfill the contract because of a psychological nature, the contract is never entered into. It's invalid. Okay? All right. Now, yes, go ahead. Yes. Sure. Right. Sure. So could you hang on for that, because I'll talk about the process at the end, okay? So don't let me forget to answer your question. Okay, so just a couple other ones. So remember what we said about what consent is. Look at our definition of consent again. The act of the will whose object is marriage, okay? So one has to choose to enter marriage as God and the church define it with that person. So if a person chooses to enter marriage, but they leave something out of that definition in their own head. Okay, so one of the things is the procreation and education of children. Like when I say, I marry you, that's included in the marriage, that I'll be open to children with you, and you'll be open to children with me. But in my head, if I say, I want to marry you, but I never want to have children, then you're not really choosing marriage. Because by definition, marriage includes being open to children. So the marriage is invalid. That's called partial simulation. You're simulating the consent. You're not really giving it. And that goes for any of the things that must be included for marriage. The good of the spouses, procreation and education of children, unity, indissolubility. Oh, I didn't put fidelity in there, but that's in there too. Fidelity, same thing. I want to marry you, but I want to keep my girlfriend on the side. Invalid, right? Because you're excluding something from the very definition of marriage. There's also this thing called total simulation, which means I go through the act of saying my vows, but I don't really want to get married. And people always, if they do that, they do it for another reason. So let's say, the woman that I'm going to go through the marriage ceremony with is a rich heiress. And I like having boats and yachts and, planes and, I really don't want to marry her, but I want to have the fortune that she's going to come into. So I go through the motions. That's invalid. It's called total simulation. Okay. Finally, one more on page 4, force and fear. There are other grounds too. These are just some of them. A marriage is invalid if entered into because of force or grave fear from without, or even if unintentionally inflicted, so that a person is compelled to choose marriage in order to be freed from it. So let's go back to my situation I said before. 16-year-old gets pregnant. The father says, you marry him or I throw you out. Invalid, because she's been forced. You can't be forced into marriage. Marriage is a free choice. Okay. Good on consent before we go into process. There's a lot there. But, okay. So, the marriage nullity process then is the investigation by the church to determine if a marriage is invalid. So first let it be said, the church presumes that a marriage is valid. It must be proven that it is invalid. So just like in the United States, we hope, you're innocent until you're proven guilty. A marriage bond is presumed to exist until proven it doesn't exist. So it has to be proven that it doesn't exist. Like in a court of law, if somebody is charged, what do you have to have in order to prove it? You have to have witnesses, you have to have motive, sometimes you have to have psychological evaluations, so forth. Same thing with judging this question of marriage nullity. The church needs testimony, witnesses, psychologicals, other evidence that can be put forward to overturn that presumption that the marriage is valid. Number 2, no one on their own can really determine this because it's too difficult, if not impossible, for the person who is in the situation to look at their own case objectively. So that's why the church has a structure to look at that objectively. Number 3, a valid consummated marriage between two baptized people is indissoluble except by death. And of course, this is the teaching of Jesus. So this is what the church is upholding. Jesus is teaching about the indissolubility of marriage unless it's proved that a marriage never actually happened, the invalidity of marriage. So what does this process look like? In our diocese, the process always starts with the pastor. Sometimes the pastor might delegate this, but interestingly, when Pope Francis made some changes to the marriage nullity process, that was about 5-7 years ago now, he specifically said that the pastor should take it upon himself to meet those who are seeking marriage nullity. Because Pope Francis wanted people who were divorced, maybe very much hurting from that divorce, who have to go through this process, which admittedly can be difficult to have to bring up old things, that the pastor himself take the time with the person to sit down with them, to go through the initial papers, to explain what's going to happen with the marriage nullity process. So that's really where it starts, with the pastor. Now, in a big place like St. Vincent's, it might not be that the pastor can do that, so he might get one of the other priests to do it. But just so that you know, that's the mind of the church, right? This pastoral care, this shepherding of those who are maybe in this situation that have to petition for marriage nullity. There's a bunch of paperwork, that has to be filled out just about normal things, where you were married, where you were baptized, where the other person was married, if there were previous marriages. Some witnesses are named at that time who may have known the couple well. And then all that is sent into the tribunal. The first step after that is that the person who is applying for the annulment is called in for a one-on-one interview with one of the people in the tribunal. And basically the interview is just a life history. They'll just ask you questions about, your growing up, your school life, your spouse's growing up, his school life, your dating, marriage, what happened in the marriage, it's just a history. And then from there, the judge will look at it and will determine a ground. So from that person who initially goes in is called the petitioner. So the petitioner, he looks at your testimony, if you're the petitioner, and he will determine one of these grounds that I mentioned here, or there's some other grounds that I didn't mention, to say this is the ground that we should pursue. So in other words, the tribunal doesn't look at all grounds for every judgment. It kind of pinpoints one ground that it looks like it's possible that this marriage is invalid. So that gets to your question, right? So sometimes the judge will pinpoint that on the person who's petitioning. Sometimes from their testimony they'll say, no, it's the other person, the ex-spouse, who in the tribunal process is called the respondent. So the respondent is the one who looks like their consent was invalid or whatever it might be. Sometimes it's on both. It could be that the consent of both was invalid. But that's how it's pinpointed into one or the other on certain grounds. It could be changed through the process if other evidence comes forward. So that gets to the next step. The respondent then is invited to come in for a one-on-one interview. Sometimes they will participate and sometimes they won't. If they participate, it's really helpful. If they don't participate, it doesn't mean it's the end of the case necessarily. Some cases are harder to prove without the respondent's participation, but not everyone. Then witnesses that were named are called in, same thing. They're asked questions, those same questions. The respondent has the right to name witnesses too. Sometimes the respondent is for the annulment, sometimes they're not for the annulment. And by the way, what is the church for? The church is for the truth. So the church isn't biased one way or the other. The church just wants to discover the truth of what the reality is about that marriage bond. By the way, marriage nullity process is a trial. What's on trial? The marriage bond. What's not on trial? The people. That's a common misunderstanding. Like, the church is going to see the fault. This person was at fault. That's not what this is about. It's only about looking at the marriage bond and whether it existed or not. The people are not on trial. Once all that testimony is collected then, sometimes if the grounds are one of these psychological grounds, the judge will ask the person to go for a psychological evaluation. And that happens in 90% of the cases. And I do have to say on that point, if a person is going to petition for an annulment and they're not willing to go for a psychological evaluation if asked, then they shouldn't even petition. Like, the person should be willing to do everything in their power to present the evidence that's necessary, including submitting themselves for a psychological evaluation. Because I can't tell you how many times that I have, as a judge, the other judges said the same thing, that a petitioner petitions, they might even just want the grounds on the other person. Sometimes that's understandable. But the person petitions, the judge says, no, we think the grounds should be on you. That's what I see. Will you go for a psychological evaluation? No. Okay. But I want a judgment. Okay, here's your negative. I mean, like, it's valid until proven invalid. You have to be willing to give the evidence. Does that make sense to everyone? I just, I know this is a judicial process, but as a priest, as a pastor, that always really broke my heart. Because if I had the information I needed, I might probably be able to give that an affirmative. But because the person themselves won't give me what I need, I have to say no, right? Because the presumption is that it's valid, and you have to have the evidence. And the judge, by the way, who's he looking at when he makes a judgment? Almighty God, right? I have to say as a judge before Almighty God, this is what I believe is the truth. So even if I feel bad for the person, I have to be able to say, before Almighty God, I believe this marriage is invalid in order for me to sign invalid. Okay. Yes? Yeah, right, sure. That's a good question, and that does come up sometimes. The short answer to your question is no, because both parties in the marriage have a right to the process. However, there are safeguards we can put in place. For example, the person themselves never has to contact the ex-spouse if they don't want to. The tribunal sends all the the stuff. If it's a matter of residence, I know that we've done this sometimes. Like there are several different places that you could do the annulment. You can do the annulment in the diocese in which you were married. You can do the annulment in the diocese in which the petitioner now lives, or you could do the annulment in which the respondent now lives, or where most witnesses live. So sometimes, like people don't want the ex-spouse to know even where they live, that will switch dioceses so that they're getting information from another diocese about the annulment. So there are ways, my point is, there are ways to kind of protect the person. But if we know where the person is, we can't go forward without contacting them. There are some times when we don't know where the person is, honestly, that we don't. And the case can go forward anyway. But if we know where they are, we have to try to contact them. Okay. Yes, did you have a hand up? No? Good. Sometimes the respondent can too. Sometimes the respondent will go. If the respondent does it or the petitioner? The respondent, yeah. Yeah, so if the respondent doesn't do it and the grounds are on the respondent, sometimes it makes it harder to prove the case, for sure. Sometimes, like I said before, we can have a psychological expert just look at the testimony and see if they can come to a conclusion based on the testimony itself. That does happen sometimes. And it also happens with the petitioner. It just, as I said, I want to keep beating a dead horse, but if the petitioner can go, they should go. Yes? The respondent? Yeah. Then it just stops. The person is free to marry. Then the annulment case just stops. The person then is free to marry because it breaks the bond, right? So there's no real need to continue with the annulment case to determine validity. Yeah. Okay? All right, so we got all the testimony. Maybe we got the psychological evaluation, we hope, if it's a psychological ground. The case then goes to what's called the advocate. So each party in the annulment case, the petitioner and the respondent, have what's called an advocate who sort of argues their side. Not sort of, they do. They argue your side. So it's a person who works in the tribunal, who is either expert in this or is a canon lawyer, and they will write a brief to say, this is why I think the judge should say this marriage has been proven to be invalid. Or the opposite is true too. The respondent might say, I don't think it's invalid, I think it's valid. And so the respondent's advocate would write a brief saying, this is why I think it's valid. Then all that goes to what's called the defender of the bond, who is sort of the devil's advocate. They used to call that in the old days, the devil's advocate. But the defender of the bond always argues why the judge should uphold the bond. In other words, should not declare that it's proven, should declare that it's not proven, that the bond still exists. The judge takes all that, reviews it, and then applies the jurisprudence of the church to the case and decides if there's enough evidence to overturn the presumption of validity. And if so, it's called in the affirmative. So if the annulment is granted, it's granted in the affirmative. If it's not, it's in the negative. If it's affirmative, then the respondent has an opportunity to appeal if they don't like the decision, if they think it's valid. Our appeals court is to Indianapolis. Vice versa, if it's a negative and either party thinks it should be an affirmative, they can appeal to Indianapolis. All parties can also appeal directly to Rome at that point, to the Roman Emperor. But a little caveat on that, if you appeal to Rome, it's usually 2 years. So it's a little slow once it gets to Rome. Does that answer all the questions I think it does. Gave me about the parties and the grounds. Yeah. Yes? Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. Right. Yeah. So what the judge will do at the beginning when he sets the grounds is he actually will not only set the grounds according to what he thinks are the grounds, but if there are several grounds that might present themselves, which one would be easiest to prove? So there's no use, like if the respondent, for example, isn't going to participate and you don't have testimony about the infidelity, like, we got to go with the easiest one to prove. So that's why that maybe they went that way. Go ahead, Chris. Yeah, in this diocese, if everything goes smoothly, they're running about 6 months right now. They're really pretty fast. It's 6 to 9 months. Now, when I say goes smoothly, sometimes, like, it's hard to get a witness to cooperate for a couple months. Sometimes things can kind of drag it down in the process that aren't necessarily the tribunal's fault. So it can go longer than that. But if it goes to Indianapolis, those are running 1 year pretty much right on the mark, 1 year. Yeah. Yes. In Indy? Here or in Indy? Indy, yeah. Okay, 2 years, she said in Indy. Now, 1 year if it goes smooth. More than 1 year if it doesn't go smooth. Yeah, 1 year here. Yeah, it can vary depending on the caseload. So right now I know they're going very quickly. So it can be here anywhere from 6 to 12 months, depending on where the caseload is.
Question. All right. The annulment's not going through because the person that I'm sorry, I'm not.
The respondent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is not cooperating.
Yeah.
There's no diagnosis.
Yeah.
But the end result is being seen now in the children. And the children are experiencing the same effect that the spouse did.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way they can use some of their experience now, showing the effects that it's being proven?
Yeah, yeah.
There's no
Yeah.
other person she wants to marry.
Yeah.
She just wants the annulment.
Right. The tribunal is very careful about involving children of the parties in the process for some obvious reasons. We don't want to pit, right. We don't want to pit children necessarily one against the other, but sometimes adult children, yes, can be used as witnesses. So that does happen sometimes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so there's an appeal period, and since I've been out, forgive me, since I've been out of this so long, I don't remember the exact amount of time. I think it might be 15 days. Yeah, so after the annulment is granted, the respondent has 15 days to appeal. If they don't appeal within that time, then the judgment becomes final. If they appeal during that time, then they would go to Indy or Rome. Yeah, I think it's 15. I might be, don't quote me on that. I've been out of the business for a little while. No, it's not years, no. Yes, then you're good. Oh, participate at the beginning. Yes.
Does that end contact with them? Do they still give the...
Yeah.
Are they still notified of the...
Yeah. It will end contact with them if they say they want contact ended, except they have to be sent the final decision. Yeah. That's a determination. Yes. That was a determination from Rome. That if they say, I don't want anything else, we still have to send them the final thing. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah, I guess that's it for me. Yes, go ahead. Right. Yeah. Yeah, so they don't, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sure. I guess all I can say is the church has a specific law that covers that, that says children of, they call it a putative marriage. So a putative marriage is a marriage that seemed to be valid, but then later was proven invalid. Children of a putative marriage are legitimate. So the church just declares that they're legitimate. There's no sense at all of illegitimacy in those situations. Yes? Putative, not punitive. Putative, yeah, yeah. And really, actually, by the way, as far as legitimacy goes, that doesn't really even that word doesn't even really mean anything anymore. I think it did in past ages, like who could inherit property, but today it doesn't even have really any legal effects in the church. Yeah, it's a spiritual thing more, but it's not a legal thing. Yeah, there's no real legal effects. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, thank you for being such a good crowd. Oh yeah, one more. Yeah. Sure. Sure. Well, that's good. I'm glad. Right. Sure. Right. Well, if you want to know something that you could send to others, I basically did this same talk. Gosh, it's been maybe 8 years ago now, at the University of St. Francis, and it's online. And if you go to the diocesan website, diocesefwsb.org, and go to the tribunal link, you can find it. And I'm just not saying that this is because of me, just because of the interest. So that, it's a YouTube video, and in 8 years it has 30,000 views. So to your point, that's how interested people are in this kind of thing. Now that's 30,000 views from all over the world, but so if you want to have basically this talk on a video, you can find that on the diocesan website under the tribunal tab. Okay, sure.
Someone who's been waiting 2 years has not heard anything. I mean, as far as yay or nay.
Here or in Indy or? It's in Indy, yeah. Well, they should talk to their advocate, because their advocate can always find out what's going on. Yeah. And the person themselves has to talk to their advocate. Yeah. Okay. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And may the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, descend upon you and remain with you forever. Amen. Thank you all. Nice to be with you here tonight.